Osio! Dohijun! Ogan Davodo! So in the Cherokee language, I just said, hello, how are you? And I stated my name. And my name I received several years ago at the Cherokee Nation at the Teuton ceremonial grounds. But I'm also called Sean, Teuton, that's my last name. And I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And I'm a professor of English here at the U of A. And I direct the Indigenous Studies program. And we've got nothing but great things to say today about the Indigenous Studies program. We're very proud to have hired a fluent Cherokee Nation speaker, Mr. Lawrence Panther, who's modestly sitting at the back of the class for a change. A lot of familiar faces tonight too. People from Cherokee Nation, people of U of A, some new faces. This is going to be a great crowd tonight. I'd like to introduce our guest tonight. His name is Wadhe, and he works for the Cherokee Nation, and he has been at the very forefront. Let's say like for 14 years, he's worked for Cherokee Nation at the forefront of our language revitalization efforts. And he works tirelessly in what's called the Master Apprentice Program, where Cherokee Nation puts a fluent speaker in constant contact with an eager student. And the great hope is that we're going to create more speakers that can fan out across Cherokee Nation like tendrils or web. You use your metaphor. And so we're doing wonderful work in the language. At the same time, he's also a storyteller. And I got the chance to hear some of his stories a few years ago, and I was blown away. So I'm hoping tonight he will do a little bit of both, or do a lot of stories. It's up to him, right? But before we begin, as I want to say a word about storytelling. I'm a literary scholar. I teach a course in Native American oral literatures. And I'd like to speak to what's often called the truth about stories. Now, for Native Americans, generally speaking, we tell stories not to deceive, but to tell truths. And a good storyteller will be speaking truths into the morning hours. Not that long. A storyteller, an indigenous storyteller, would never tell a lie. That's not the purpose of a story. It's to affirm a truth. And it may be a different kind of truth, more of what's often called a communal truth. But these are stories we tell each other and our people to remind ourselves of our place in the world and the beautiful world that it is, right? And when, for example, a native storyteller tells the story, retells the story of the creation, of a cosmology, of all the proper places of the plants and animals and people, and the careful relationships that must be maintained, that is an act of what's often called world building. The word itself, in its mere expression, brings something into being, once again, in a more restored way, a more purified way than maybe it might have gone a little tarnished over time. Right? And that's one of the great powers of storytelling. Another point of storytelling and that truth-telling is to remember that you might think of storytelling as two landscapes. There's the landscape outside, composed of trees and animals and events and seasons and the leaves falling right now, right? And that is an exterior landscape. But the storyteller works in telling stories to remind us of that interior landscape, that landscape of the mind. And if a storyteller is talented, he or she will be able to, over time, describe that land out there and all its features, and then be able to reproduce it in your mind as you listen. And then ideally, those two landscapes finally meet and fit over each other like a template. And when that's accomplished, a great feeling of well-being, happiness, joy, an affirmation of the goodness of our people, of our lives, of our relationships. All that's accomplished with a good story. So that's why we tell stories. Okay, I would like to hear now, say me a round of applause for Wadhe.
I think I'm finding a way away from everybody, but I'm safe. I've got all three of my shots. So this is my email address, in case you need to get a hold of me. It's kind of long. Siona Godwin, we to all again. What they can be scared to gun dog no dig to lick to nail. You got a deal toss out as you don't. Ken would dig it again. Ani Foreman, sit on nail, Dawadalena, he Jews go and dig a do. Usti dig a do, walk the soy, du had the toss, du had the Google, skin now, Tessa. Iju, the Gaggy Gayan Yonega Han, on the one east. Talene agiboni histi chalak si degades kwan talene agiboni histi degades boski do you gali aliga jize dohan it's a yali elitis. I've been learning Cherokee for most of my life now. Both of my parents spoke English. They were English speakers, they weren't Cherokee speakers. On my mom's side of the family, they're Foremans from Oaks. My oldest aunt and uncle, they spoke Cherokee, but my mom didn't. And my dad, he's a little bit Delaware, but he didn't speak Cherokee either. Well, he actually speaks more Cherokee than my mom. He dated my mom's first cousin before he dated my mom, and she speaks Cherokee. So he learned a little bit from her. And he's always been really supportive of my language learning and supportive of our Cherokee identity on my mom's side of the family. He says, I don't understand them. They're real different. They didn't last. But they can talk to each other. They can get along. And I have a son, a Gali Sig du Dong, Sawa Chu Cha. He's a good kid, and they're able to get along well enough to come to his birthday parties together. So that's how much they love me. But I've been learning Cherokee my whole life. When I was a kid, I was around it. I listened to it, and I learned a few words here or there. But when I reached adolescence, I came to the realization that my family they grew up on the edge of the prairie. There weren't a lot of speakers in the town that I grew up in. We would go back to my grandparents' hometown, Oaks, and there were speakers there, a lot more speakers there. And a lot of my grandpa's family, they were actually from Kenwood, and there were a whole lot of speakers there. But I didn't think it was really my job to learn Cherokee. I didn't think it was my job to carry on that sort of thing. It wasn't with my mom. It wasn't with my dad. It wasn't with any of my cousins. But when we would go back east and visit where my family came from, there were always people talking Cherokee. So I thought it was strong and healthy. And not only did I not think it was my responsibility, I didn't think that I had a right to it. Since I didn't grow up really with it in my immediate family, I didn't think it belonged to me. And some of my cousins, my mom, didn't marry a full-blood by any means. There aren't a lot of full-blood Delawares. Actually, you'd be hard-pressed to find one. But some of my aunts did. So some of my cousins were pretty dark, and they would always tease me, and they'd say, "Oh, you aren't Indian enough. You aren't Indian enough to worry about it." That's what they would say. You know, I kind of took that to heart for a long time, and then in high school, I was like, you know, this is a really cool language. This is a really cool language. I was really impressed with, you know, what I heard. Some of my family they would talk Cherokee, and then they would tell me what it meant. And I was really impressed with the complexity of thought that existed in Cherokee. And it was hard for them to translate from Cherokee to English because they said that English just didn't capture the meaning. And so I had kind of an intellectual curiosity, but I still didn't really think it was my job or my right. Then I went to college and I thought, I'm going to take Cherokee as my foreign language requirement. And I did, and I fell in love with it. I fell in love with it. In fact, my native studies classes, my Cherokee language classes, that's what kept me going. That's what enabled me to graduate. Without that sort of support and the support of the student organizations on campus, I wouldn't have made it through. And I'm just about done with my master's now. And I don't have that sort of support with my master's program because it's online. And it's TESOL, teaching English to speakers of other languages. But I don't want to teach English to anybody. I want to teach Cherokee. So they're letting me flip everything. And so all of my work is almost in reverse. So my papers are longer than they should be. And I have to translate things from Cherokee to English in my papers so I can show them good examples. And it's been a challenge, but I'm going to finish. I'm going to get it done. When I started working for the tribe, I was really into culture. In my family, we grew up, my grandma was Baptist, my grandpa grew up at the ceremonial grounds, and when he married my grandma, that ended. Because you follow the women. That was the way of things. And I was kind of limited in my experience. I would go to stomp dances, but I never again really felt like I had a right to it. And somebody set me down one day and they said, "We don't see a lot of young people here. Why don't you do something other than visit? Why are you just here a couple of times a year? If you care about this, you would be here every month." I don't know. I talked to people back home once I graduated from school and I started living in Tahlequah. I went to my family up in Oaks and up in Kenwood, and they said, "We don't have young people speaking." People my age understand it. They can speak a few words, but they aren't comfortable enough in the language to have conversations. So I looked around and I thought this was everybody else's responsibility. And I didn't think it was mine. But people started asking me, "This is something you care about, why isn't it something you're doing?" Even before I moved back, I started going to dances as often as I could. I started hanging out with elders in my family and outside of my family. And I started getting to know older folks. So when I moved back to Cherokee County, I spent a lot of time with people's parents and grandparents, people my age's parents and grandparents. I didn't make a lot of friends with people my age. And over the last 20 years, I've had a lot of really close friends pass away. I got to really enjoy spending time with those elders. I got to enjoy eating with them, having good conversations with them. It was really an honor and a privilege. But I never thought about the consequence. So in the process, I've tried to learn as much language as I can. And it's been really challenging. My brain was in English. And when you go into a Cherokee situation, you have this confirmation bias. So it's really hard to turn your thinking around. Even when you ask all these questions, you come up with these word lists, you memorize these word lists, you start using Cherokee words. I was using them like they were English words. So I was speaking English using Cherokee words. So I really wasn't speaking Cherokee. I really got into the culture, and I talked to a lot of those elders, and they said, really, we can't tell you about this unless it's in Cherokee. That's what they said. There are things that I just won't tell you. It's I run out of English. But they were being nice, but they were gonna tell me. They said, if you really want to understand this, you're gonna have to come and listen in Cherokee. And I would. Sometimes I would record them. I would go home and I would listen to those recordings again and again, and I really had a hard time picking out what was said. But I knew that the language was the key to really the deeper parts of culture. I could learn how to weave a basket. I could learn how to make a pot. But I didn't really understand the worldview. I heard people tell stories in English, but they would tell a story in Cherokee and everybody would laugh, and I would ask one of my friends, what did they say? They'd say, oh, it's not funny in English. I'll tell it to you later. And they would, and it wasn't funny. It's just not funny in English. So I knew there was a lot that I was missing. And so I tried to learn as much language as I could, and I pastored people. I worked at the Cherokee Nation. Speakers would see me coming down the hall, and they would just shake their head because they knew that I was going to take up the rest of their day. If I had some time off, that's what I was doing. I was asking questions, and it helped me. I got well versed enough in Cherokee to be able to explain why Cherokee was important to non-Cherokee speakers. I learned enough of the culture to be able to describe some things to non-Cherokee speakers. I learned enough of the stories to be able to tell stories to non-Cherokee speakers. And people were interested. Some of the children and grandchildren of the elders that I had made friends with started to contact me, and they would ask me, when you talked to Daddy, what was it that he told you? And so it was a big honor for me to try to convey what I was given back to the family that let me borrow it for a little bit. So I got to do a lot of cultural outreach. And I did enough of it to where administration at that time said, we want you to go around all over the United States to different Cherokee communities. There were 25 at-large Cherokee communities. 8 of them in California, some of them in New Mexico, Arizona. There's one in Chicago, there's a couple down in Florida, there's several in Texas, some in Kansas. There's even one in Fort Smith. So if it's outside of the Cherokee Nation reservation boundaries, and there's a group of folks that organize, they become an at-large Cherokee community. And we have 25, and they vote. And so our leaders said, let's go to these Cherokee communities, throw them a hog fry, feed them, bring some storytellers, and give them a little bit of culture, and answer their questions, and maybe they'll like our administration enough to put us in another term. So I got put on that crew where I would go out to all these different communities and basically entertain people. But at some point, it was my job to introduce the chief. So before the chief would speak, I would have the microphone. And I would get up in front of the crowd and I would say, our language is the heart of our culture. You can have a culture without a language, but all it is an echo. That first generation, without speakers, they can echo what was done before. But the next generation, the echo gets more silent, and then the next generation, it's even more silent. Till at some point, that echo fades away. So culture can live for a little bit without language, but the language is its lifeblood, its vitality. I pointed out that what makes us Idi, Idi Tsalek, Idigaduwagi is a card when it comes to the government relationship that our tribe has with the United States. This card says that my tribe chose me. I meet the requirements of this card. My tribe has chosen me. But it doesn't say anything about my responsibility. Just like when I was young, I always thought it was somebody else's responsibility. But by the time I was speaking to the older folks, I realized that it was my responsibility. And so when I got up in front of those Cherokees all across the United States, I said, this card means that your tribe chose you, but you won't have a tribe if you don't serve your tribe. If this card was taken away, what would make you Cherokee? Is it because you have a Cherokee speaker in your family? Did your grandpa speak Cherokee? Did your grandma speak Cherokee? Was your great-grandpa full blood? What makes you Cherokee? What do you do? A lot of times people rely on their family ties, and that's a part of it. Kinship is a part of that identity. Land base is a part of that identity. We were removed from the east, we came to the west. We have a new land base. But for people that don't live on that land base, they don't have that resource. Another part of our identity is our, I guess you could call it religion. It was described by Sapir, like the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Sapir wrote a paper about it. He talked about religion, sacred history, land base, and language being key factors that tie the people together. Even through the Jewish diaspora, they were able to maintain their identity because they had 3 out of these 4 things. So what do Cherokees have? We do have 2 religious systems that I could say, honestly, are Cherokee. We've got the Cherokee Baptist Association, then we've got the ceremonial grounds. At this point, each ceremonial ground is its own society. They don't all agree, but really the Baptist churches don't either. But technically, we have 2 different traditions that are Cherokee. And the Cherokee Baptist Association was created by Cherokees for Cherokees. Now, it's based upon a Western Christian tradition, but those elders, over 100 years ago, they got together and they made it their own. And it's not the same as the rather regular Southern Baptist Convention. It's a different system. However, those 2 traditions don't always see eye to eye. What they do have in common, though, is an oral tradition that has to do with certain values, behaviors, and beliefs. They're not always codified into any sort of religious doctrine, but the average Cherokee knows what it means when an owl shows up on your window at night. An average Cherokee knows that you can burn cedar to help yourself feel better after that happens. Doesn't matter whether they're Baptist or whether they go to the ceremonial grounds, they have shared values, behaviors, and beliefs. And we could call that oral tradition. It's been passed down in our families and in our communities from one generation to the next. And so it still exists. That could qualify as our sacred history. So we still have our cultural identity. But those people that have it strongest are people that are either speakers or have Cherokee speakers in their family. It seems to be these values, behaviors, and beliefs are really orbiting the Cherokee language. The language is what carries it and infuses it with our people. And I would explain that to those crowds, and then I would point out, last July, we had 32 speakers pass away. The June before, we had 34 speakers speakers pass away. And this was a few years back. It's not that bad now, but we had a particularly bad summer, and I really leaned into it. And it was bad. And they would say, how many speakers do you have? I'd say, we don't know. They did a survey in 2002, and the survey sent out, they sent it out to 80,000 citizens. And approximately 300 folks responded to it. And out of those 300 respondents, they extrapolated there were 10,000 Cherokee speakers. So if we're losing 30 a month, we go backwards in time, even if it was that many speakers then, we've lost at least half of them. That's what I would point out to people. What are we going to do? Well, we have the immersion school. We've got community language classes. But that was pretty much the crux of it. NSU, Northeastern State University, has a Cherokee language degree program, but their goal isn't necessarily to teach people to become fluent Cherokee. It's to get them certified so they'll be state certified to teach Cherokee in public schools. And so speakers could enter that program and get their teacher certification, and they came out pretty well prepared to do that. Second language folks going in there, they weren't able to leave with enough language ability to be able to communicate in a language immersion setting. So they weren't adapted to go and work at the Cherokee Immersion School. Anyway, I was a big downer. And the chief noticed I was a big downer. And one day he came up to me and he said, "What can I do to make you happy?" I said, "I'll tell you what I told the previous administration. Pay me to learn Cherokee." That's what'll make me happy. Pay other people to learn Cherokee. And he didn't laugh at me. The other folks, they would laugh at me. Pay you to learn Cherokee. He said, "Well, what do we need to do?" I said, "I know one guy who went down to the Universidad de Idiomas and he learned Spanish through language immersion." I said, "Let me borrow him for a couple of weeks. We'll put a proposal together for you." So we did. And we started a master apprentice program, and the goal was to have people in there for 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week for 2 years. We did the calculations. NSU noticed that even though they built the program to mirror kind of a Spanish teacher program, some of the folks would leave that Spanish-speaking program able to speak pretty good Spanish. Hardly anybody was leaving the Cherokee program speaking Cherokee. And those that did, it was because they did a whole lot of time on their own working in the language. It really wasn't because they were going to Cherokee classes at NSU. It was because they established relationships with speakers and bothered them 24/7. So it turns out that the federal government uses this ranking system to rank languages. When I was in college, the linguists would tell me all languages are equally difficult. It's true if you're a baby. But if you already speak Spanish, it's easier to learn Portuguese or Italian or another Romance language than it is to learn Japanese or even German. So it's easier to learn languages similar to the language that you already speak. I mean, that's kind of a no-brainer. And so the U.S. military, the Department of Defense, ranked languages on how many hours it took to become conversational in that language for an English speaker. So languages like Spanish, they were saying about 7,200 hours. 7,200 hours. Yeah, that's 7,200, right?
Yes.
Or is it 720? It was 720. I'm inflating things. Let me write it down. 720. And that was a level 1 language. German, a level 2 language. Even though English is Germanic, it has captured a lot of the intricacy of Romance languages, not Germanic languages. It was close to, I think, 1,200. Level 3 languages, they were about 2,200. And then level 4 languages, They were thinking about 2,800 to 3,200. And level 3 languages are languages like Farsi or Arabic. Level 4 languages, that's Chinese, Hmong, Korean, Japanese. They have to have a different orthography, a different written system as well. There's a different grammar and syntax and subject, verb system. You know, English is usually, what does it go? I am running. Subject, verb, no, I am running, wait, no. I'm running to town, subject, verb, object. So that's a pretty common pattern. English is backwards. Most of the world's languages, they have a syntax that's more like Yoda from Star Wars. And Cherokee does too. So we're actually in good company there. But we figured, you know, Cherokee had to fall on the scale somewhere. And the feds said they would not rank our language. Wyman Kirk, he was really high up, one of the faculty at NSU. He was really kind of the mastermind behind getting a lot of things going in the language. He's a little older than me, so he's been at it a little longer. And he wrote those folks in the military and asked them to rate our language, and they said, no, it's not of military significance, which is a good thing. But they said, based upon what he said about the language, they would put it at a 4, and if not a 4, a 5. So we knew that, you know, the 2,800-hour work week that you get after a year of work, you know, what is it, 54 weeks a year, 40 hours a week? I'm not really great at math. We knew that somebody wasn't going to catch this in 1 year, even if they were going all the time. So we thought 2 years. 2 years might be overkill, but it's going to be hard to convince people to stay in Cherokee. So if we can get them in Cherokee 80 to 90% of the time, and we give them 2 years, they'll walk out of there conversational. That was our goal. That's what we started with. We talked to administration. They said, how much would it cost? And we said, we did something evil. So in the Western world, it wasn't always like this, but it's become like this. Things have become quantified. If you can turn it into a number, you can use that number to express financial value. So quantitative analysis versus qualitative analysis doesn't have anything to do with the way that the federal government looks at things. They look at things through dollar bills. And so that's what we did to them. I said, if we weren't federally recognized, what would it require to become a federally recognized tribe? And there are these 7 rules that the federal government goes by. And primarily is cultural continuity. And the way the primary reason that they use this is because a lot of tribes have lost their language. And so if you don't have your language, they'll say you don't have cultural continuity. And so I pointed out that without our language, we wouldn't be able to seek federal recognition if we didn't already have it. And I said, well, they're not going to shut us down if we lose our language. I said, they might not. I said, well, they didn't shut down this tribe or that tribe or this tribe or that tribe. I said, how many were they in those tribes? What was their population? They were all under 20,000. How many Cherokee citizens are there? Oh, I don't know, 360,000 or so. How many United Kituah Band citizens? 16,000. How many Eastern Band citizens? 16,000. Altogether, about 400,000. We all share the same language. There are dialect differences, but we all share the same language. Wouldn't you wait until we lost our language before you start shutting down other tribes for losing their language? If you're going to take people out, take out the big numbers. Don't take out the little numbers. And if somebody was sanctioned for losing their language, wouldn't we spend a whole lot of money trying to save our language? So no, they're not going They're not going to punish anybody else, but might they punish us? They might. Wouldn't they love to get rid of the Indian problem? I mean, they've been dealing with the Indian problem for, well, since the 1870s. That's what they called it. Historically, that's still what they call it behind closed doors. I guarantee it. So maybe our sovereignty is somewhat dependent upon our cultural identity. If that's the case, how much money does the Cherokee Nation bring in a year? That year it happened to bring in $1.2 billion. So how many speakers do we have? I don't know, 10,000? We know that's too many. Let's take 1.2 billion and divide it by 10,000. That's how much each speaker is worth. So how much does it cost to make a speaker? Much less than that. So there we got a value. Because they were complaining about the immersion school, because the average immersion school student was about $36,000 to get through. About $36,000. And that's per year. Per year. So if they're in the immersion school for preschool, pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, that's 9 years. We'll bump it up. Maybe they were held back 10 years. So, that's $350,000 for immersion school graduate. That's a lot. I said we can do adults cheaper than that. So we started crunching the numbers, and we thought, well, if we give them $10 an hour, 40 hours a week for 2 years, that's not enough to survive on. But we talked to our education department, and they said, if we give it to them like it's a scholarship, they don't have to pay taxes. So they go to class 40 hours a week, they come home with $100 in their pocket. We need to up it again. Cost of living has increased. We don't want our people to starve. But it helps ensure that they come to class. It gives them an incentive to learn Cherokee. But nobody is going to get rich learning Cherokee. It's just that simple. Our administrators don't make that much money. We work hard to make sure that our Cherokee speaking teachers make the most money. We give them the best pay scale. Because one of the things that we realized is that for centuries, people that spoke Cherokee were considered less than. They were talked down to, they were talked down about, they were set on the sidelines. A lot of Cherokees like to work outside, but I still wonder why the majority of the people that work for our facilities are Cherokee speakers. A lot of Cherokees don't like to necessarily deal with the public and work the cash registers or concession stands. But in our casinos, why do a lot of our first language fluent speakers work in the custodial department? Maybe they want to, maybe they want to be managers. Maybe they want to get paid more. So we don't know. I can't say you need to be up at the front of the line. You can't push people up to the front of the line. But they've had to deal with racism. Just because you're a high blood quantum Cherokee doesn't mean that you speak Cherokee. It doesn't mean that you're a cultural expert. But I'll tell you that those communities that do have high blood quantum Cherokees survived because they knew the culture. They survived because they knew the language. When Oklahoma became a state, the mixed blood Cherokees had positions of power and authority, and they left their Cherokee identity behind. They assimilated and became a part of the power system, part of the power structure. They passed as white people, and they were rewarded for it. And they did all right, but the brown Cherokees didn't get to play. They weren't pulled into that same system. And so during the Great Depression, when people were suffering, they were starving to death. So they hung on to what to gather, what time of year to hunt, what to hunt at those times of year. They had to know how to live off the land. They had to maintain those traditions most grounded in our ancestral way of life, which had to do with subsistence, which had to do with being intelligent about the weather and how to survive. And so those families of high blood quantum needed the language and the culture just to survive. And so now today, they're going to be the ones that have it. It's just that simple. That's just the way of it. People my generation and younger, less so, because the world is a better place. So brown people, there's more room at the table for brown people than there used to be. I'm not saying it's great, but it's better than it was 100 years ago. So that means that I don't have to know how to cook tadpoles to survive. I don't have to know how to dress a robin to get by. I don't necessarily have to know what sort of wild greens to go out and gather just to make it through. Those are no longer requirements for my survival. They told our elders, they told our speakers, don't talk Cherokee to your children. You don't want them to suffer like you did. There was a belief that you couldn't speak Cherokee and English both and be smarter for it. There was this idea that if you spoke Cherokee, you were less intelligent than somebody that just spoke English. I don't know where that idea came from, but it's been pervasive. Now we know people that speak two languages have better executive reasoning than those that just speak one. So technically they are more intelligent. But that's not what our people were told. That's still not what our people are told. There are people that go to our immersion school that bring their kids there. The people my age, they don't talk Cherokee, but they want their kids to talk it because their own parents or grandparents spoke it. They want to make sure their kids have it. It skipped one generation, they don't want to see it skip again. And their own family gets onto them and says, don't do that. You're going to handicap them. You want to make sure that they're good in English, not good in Cherokee. If they're going to have to learn another language, it should be something useful. We hear it every day. So this way of thinking is still out there, and we have to change it. So our Cherokee language has been looked down upon, and people that speak it have been looked down upon. So if we want people to learn it, we have to raise the value of the language. Well, how do we do that? We need to raise the appreciation and value for people that speak it. So we started a campaign then, and it's not over yet. We're pushing HR to recognize people that speak Cherokee as if they already have a master's degree when it comes to pay rates. It'd be awesome if we could give them PhD status. So there are these things. We need to ensure that the value of the language is maintained, and the best way to do that is to show honor and respect to our Cherokee speakers. And so one of the things we needed to do was find out how many speakers we had. Between Cherokee Nation, United Kituwa Band, and the Eastern Band, we needed to find this out. So we went and we brought speakers in from different communities, and we started quizzing them. And these speakers are brilliant people. And several of these speakers could go down the road in their mind, and they could go from one house to the next. There was one gentleman in particular that we worked with a lot, named David Crawler, and he would just go in his mind and go from one house to the next. He'd say they have 3 speakers in their house. And in that house over there, they have 4 speakers. And then we hit people from different counties, and we did the same thing with them. And we got a head count of about 2,200 Cherokee speakers. Not very many. We said, oh, this can't be true. This is horrible. So what we did is we said, let's honor our speakers by giving them just a token of our appreciation. To say, hey, we recognize that you have this gift. This gift that means that you have something that is sacred and of utmost value to all the Cherokee people. This medal is not that thing of value, but this medal is to recognize that you already have this. And we're going to give you this medal, and we're going to put it on you, and we're going to show you that we recognize this value, we recognize your value to us. While you're at it, why don't you go ahead and sign this book? Write down your name and your address, and that way we'll know how many speakers we have. How many folks have signed it, Kristen? 1,700? 1,700 have signed it. So that original count of 22,000 might have been pretty accurate. We know we haven't got everybody. One of the people we missed is Lawrence. So one of the reasons we wanted to come up here tonight is to give him his medal and have him sign it. Kristen Thomas is one of my coworkers. She's actually the supervisor for our Master Apprentice program, where we teach people Cherokee all day long. And she is also really good with people, and she knows a lot of people. So she was one of the people that would go out in the communities and organize these events, hog fries and things, and they would bring folks in, and we would have them sign the book, and we would give them a medal. And if they couldn't make it, sometimes she would hop in the car and ride around with the speaker, and they would go to folks' houses, and they would knock on their doors and get their signatures. So this project has become her baby. So it made a lot of sense for her to come tonight. So uwoha du don't eliwus Eliwus distena hizu Igastielzu. You got it? Where do you want to do it? Do you want to do it at this desk? So Howard Payton, he was the guy that learned Spanish with immersion. He is so good with our leaders that they made him an executive director. He was the executive director of our language department. And we got this book made. It's supposed to last how long, Kristen?
They give it about 500 years.
It's an archival quality book. So we carry it to safe. Everything stays go. Nothing.
I want to do this right.
Make sure you look good and see well.
And so far, only first language speakers have been allowed to sign this book. Which is important to say because we've got some folks that are learning pretty good. We had to get permission from the United Kituwa Band tribal government, as well as the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians tribal government to direct our people. So this is a joint effort with all three of our tribes.
Here, done right. These two people here, I've known them a little while, and Kristen was working in the office at the institute. I was going to school there, and she's one of the reasons, probably the main reason why I finished college. Because one time I wanted to quit, she said, "No." I thought I'll come back in about a year or two. She said, "No, it'll still be the same, just too old." just finish. Get it over with. Get it over with. This guy right here, you know, he's taught me a lot too, you know, a lot of stories and stuff like that. You know, I respect both of them very much. And on the other hand, I really appreciate Sean for helping me out with his language here at U of A, and I'm very excited, you know, to be teaching here. I'm still on cloud nine. It's been almost over 2 months, about 2 months now, so I'm still riding high.
So last year we were put under a new department. The guy that was the program manager became our executive director. So we have a Department of Cherokee Language, the immersion schools under this new department. And so are all the old Cherokee language programs under Roy Boney Jr.'s leadership. So translation, language technology, the community language classes, and several grants that were underneath Roy Boney that were all together in the same program. The Cherokee Language Master Apprentice Program, which Kristen supervises, has been quadrupled. When we started, we had 4 learners and 3 native speakers, and it was small group master apprentice. What we learned is that when the speakers were able to communicate with each other, they could work together and provide examples and model the language. And they could also break the learners up into smaller groups to work with them one-on-one, or they could teach them as a small group, as a cohort. It also allowed our speakers to have some downtime throughout the day, because speaking Cherokee for 8 hours is exhausting. All of our speakers are, of course, first language speakers. They're fluent. They're very well versed in the language, but nobody anymore speaks Cherokee all the time. We have speakers in our communities. They're heads of families. They have kids and they have grandkids. Most of the time they're speaking English. They might get together with one of their siblings or cousins or one of their old friends, and they'll speak Cherokee for a little bit, but they don't get to live in a Cherokee world. So it was an adjustment for our native speakers to have to focus and stay in language. It was a big challenge. Not just for the learners, it made our heads hurt, made some of us throw up, but for the speakers themselves, it was a challenge. So it was good to have that group approach. Within a couple of years, we doubled that. And then over this last year, we quadrupled that. So the program, when it's fully fleshed out with all of its students, will have 32 learners at a time. But they're not all together anymore. We realized that if we were going to make it that big, we had to change the system, which is what we wanted to do from the start. So we have 4 phases. Over the period of those 2 years, we basically have 4 semesters. So the first 6 months, they're going to have 2 fluent speakers and a second language learner that helps facilitate. Second 6 months, 2 different speakers with a different facilitator. Third 6 months, again, 2 new speakers, a new facilitator. The last 6 months, 2 new speakers and another facilitator. And that means that they build in increments. One of the important things for us was for them to not just learn Cherokee, but for them to learn how to teach it. So we only developed curriculum for that first year, and folks would go and absorb as much as they could that first year, and then the second year, they would have to teach the new cohort of first-year learners. So it was their job to go back and teach. So when they left, they would have developed methodology and pedagogy to be able to help teach in a professional environment. It's harder to do that when we have this layered system now. So what we do is we have phase 3 learners come in and teach phase 1 learners. And we have phase 2 learners come in and teach, no, phase 4 learners come in and teach phase 2 learners. So it's still second years teaching first years. They don't do it the whole time. We've had to expand our curriculum. And where at first we hit really hard with immersion, and people really, I mean, they were thrown up. We thought they were stomach bugs with our learners. We would come in and they would all be outside on the breaks throwing up, and we would say, is everybody okay? And they're like, yeah, I'm ready to go back in. And they'll have like Tylenol on their little, they have these little fold-out tables like TV trays, as we'd all sit in a big circle, and everybody would have their own Tylenol bottles. And we're like, something's going on here. Well, it turns out that when you're immersed in the language, especially language that different than the language that you're used to, it not just rewires your brain, it hurts while it rewires your brain. It causes physical and emotional pain. So people were splitting up with their spouses, people were fighting with their dogs. There was all sorts of emotional fallout because of this. So we said, okay, we're going to take it easy for the first month or two. So we're a little bit easier on them. But after about a month, we say, drop the floor, let them swim. And then when they start getting sick again, we say, okay, you can start talking a little bit of English. But the thing is, what you're doing is you're saying like, this is an easy word. I'll say, Gada Usti, Hian. Gada Usti, Hian. The Usti. Go where? He, go where? Go where? Gada Usti, he, go where? That's how you teach. And you use props and you use context. You don't have to use English. But English makes people feel better. And so by the time they hit second semester, they're no more English. And by the time that they're in the fourth semester, the fourth phase, they're having conversations. They'll say, so why do you think that person said it that way instead of that way? And so they have to start to explore more abstract concepts, be able to have deeper conversations. At first, there are questions like, what is this? Who is that? But at some point, you have to ask why. And that's when the language really starts to deepen. And that's something that's really exciting for us. We've been really enjoying the new phases that we've incorporated. It's a lot of work for people, though. They're Kristen's on top of it. We have different grants that we got, so we're going to have a year 3 and 4 called the Teacher Bridge. So what we're doing now is we're going through academic articles on second language acquisition, and we're translating those into Cherokee, and we're going to have a seminar style kind of college course, but it's going to again be 8 hours a day for 2 years. So we're going to use, they're going to be discussion points. And that's the Teacher Bridge. And so it's to develop professional teaching skills, not just in practice, but also in theory. So eventually we're going to have some academic disciplines created just in our language, which is really interesting. It's not something that we know of any other tribe doing. Another thing we did is we're taking first language speakers and heritage speakers that aren't at most first language speakers level. So there are people my age that do speak Cherokee. There are about a dozen my age that speak Cherokee, but they don't speak it like Lawrence. They don't speak it like the older folks do. Our oldest Cherokee speakers that have really given a lot of thought to it, folks that used to be preachers or medicine people or leaders in their communities, they kind of speak a Shakespearean level Cherokee, like somebody that has their PhD in English speaks English. The average Cherokee speaker, they sound like somebody that was an English lit major that graduated with a bachelor's. They're pretty impressive. They know the big words, they know how to communicate. They're pretty impressive. So far, we've just made learners that can speak at the elementary level. So we have this huge gap between first language speakers and second language speakers. And so the teacher bridge is going to help with that. But we have a lot of first language speakers and heritage speakers that are also called passive speakers. So they understand everything. They grew up with the language, but they're not comfortable speaking. So we're starting a program called the Institute of Excellence, where they take, we've repatriated 5,000 documents in Cherokee. We've sorted through a lot of those, differentiated the medicine formulas from the narratives, and we've taken these narratives and this cohort of first language speakers that aren't at the top levels, we're talking maybe high school, graduate level English speakers, but in Cherokee. And they take these Cherokee documents that they can't read, which are really high level documents. They go through these documents, they circle the words and phrases they don't understand, and we contract with native speakers out in their communities that are 70, 80 years old, and they go to these native speakers and they say, what is the meaning of this word right here? And so that speaker will explain it to them, but it's all in Cherokee. So they're going and basically doing literature review with first language speakers in the communities. And then they come home and they take the explanations of those words and phrases, they incorporate them into those documents, and then those documents can be used as teaching materials. So it's to push up that next level. So we're not just trying to create second language speakers. We're trying to strengthen our first language speaker population and ensure that they can continue to grow in their language and advance in their language. Because without supporting our native speakers, we're really not doing a good job. So we have those two new programs. We have several other grants that we work on. We have the immersion school, and very recently, they just announced that they're opening an immersion school close to here in Adair County, not too far from Stillwell, just in Greasy. I don't know if you guys know where Greasy is. But Cherokee Nation bought Greasy School, and they're turning it into an immersion school. So we need to make Cherokee speaking teachers as fast and as hard as we can. So we're going to have to keep up with that mandate. So that's kind of the less fun stuff that I wanted to talk about tonight. And now I'm going to tell you some stories, but before I do that, I want to answer questions that you might have. Look at what time it is.
Did you stay with your family?
Yeah. When I went to OU, I apologize for going to OU. When I went to OU, he was my Cherokee teacher. And he was also my mom's second cousin.
Really?
Yeah.
That's so cool. He was a loss.
Yeah, he was amazing. He was a first language speaker and a linguist. And it's not impossible, but it's just not common. And he was also a preacher, a man of God. He was humble, he was kind, he was giving, and he was really funny. So yeah, and really every one of most of our native speakers don't have that degree, right? But what I've always found really interesting, even when I was a young man, I would hang out with our elders. I would say, these people are amazing. Have they ever done anything bad? Have they always been this amazing? I mean, these are people that are like superheroes. Their compassion, their kindness, their sense of service and responsibility, they go above and beyond to take care of not just their family, but other families in their community. How come they're so amazing? It's because they grew themselves to be. They suck just as much as I do when they were my age, but they got better. They got better. So anytime we lose an elder, a native speaker, just an elder from the community, it's like the entire library of Alexandria burned down again.
And he just left a year ago August.
Yeah, it was really a sad deal. So here's the thing: almost all the Cherokees are probably the most widely written about tribe in the United States. We have more literature on us than any other tribe. Our genealogy, our social patterns, our subsistence patterns, we got reams and reams of literature on Cherokees. But it was all written by non-Cherokees, for non-Cherokees. So everything about us was not for us. It was not by us. Recently, with some artists, the first one that popped to my head was Sequoia Guest, you guys, and he passed away recently too. We've had some people writing about Cherokees that are Cherokee. That's pretty new, like Turtle Island storytellers.
Yeah.
This is a new phenomenon. These are folks that are writing for Cherokees. We've had Cherokee writers now for about 40 years, but until recently, even they were writing for the outside audience. They weren't writing for Cherokees. They were writing for academia or something else. And now we have Cherokees writing for Cherokees. And that's what we need more of. It's something new. And it harkens back to our traditions. You know, when the original Sequoia created the syllabary, you know, it was done 100 years ago. This fall, 200 years ago, sorry, I can't count, I'm bad with that. He started in 1809, and he finished in 1821, and I believe it was ratified by council in 1825. I'm better with dates than that. And he allowed our people to write down things that had never been written down before. Now, we immediately took advantage of it when it came to religious or spiritual practices. There are lots of medicine formulas written down, lots of church ledgers, lots of hymns, several different copies of the New Testament. But for the most part, when Cherokees were writing, they mainly used it for spiritual purposes. They didn't necessarily use it for entertainment. So we didn't have a lot of novels in Cherokee. We didn't have a lot of what we would consider Cherokee literature. Not a lot of narrative. Sometimes people would write to their families, write letters back and forth. Durbin Philin used to do that with his mom when he was in the military. Sometimes people write memoirs, but we don't have a strong tradition of poetry. We don't have a strong tradition of fiction. We just don't have it. Which kind of brings up what Dr. Teuton was talking about when it comes to storytelling. So why don't we write down our stories? James Mooney wrote it down, right? Everybody's kind of talked trash about him for that. But some people are starting writing down. Hastings Shade was another amazing person. Hastings Jugesa. He wrote some stuff down, and last year his widow passed away. And she was just as amazing as he was. She was just behind the scenes, and she was no more quiet. In fact, she was more outspoken than he was. Loretta Shade, you guys, she was amazing, and she kept his literature alive. Yeah, for quite well since he passed on, you would see her selling his books, and if you ever get a chance, talk to his son Larry Shade and make sure that they continue to sell those things. I hope that their memory never fades. So every one of our speakers, they are a library. Since we did not prefer to write down things that we memorized, almost all of those experiences are just stored in people's memories. And so when a speaker passes, that's it. And they all go with stories. So I grew up with stories. A lot of the stories I was told, they were not the really cool Cherokee stories that people tell, like Robert Lewis or Chuchi Kingfisher, or even Sequoia Gas. These are stories that, this is what Grandpa used to do, and this is what Grandma used to do. Back when her Aunt so-and-so was a little girl, this is what she used to do when we went by. So they were all like personal family stories, like everybody told. All around the world, people would tell these personal family stories. And people also had wonder stories. And I think that, for every wonder story that somebody hears about, maybe Trickster Rabbit or what the Thunder Twins did or something like that, there are probably 100 to 200 of those personal stories that are told in that same context. So when people come in front of a group like this, they don't tell the personal story. You guys really don't need to know about my Uncle Don and his sweet tea addiction and his addiction to telling dirty jokes. But sometimes those are also narratives that need to be captured. Those are narratives that we need to find a place for them. But ultimately, it's those old stories that are tied to what I would say is our medicine worldview. So we got this word in Cherokee, no what, and it comes from the word to heal. It's really clear that that's where the word medicine comes from. And a lot of times people don't pronounce the final vowel on nouns or present tense verbs. It's understood, so why do people say it? Nobo is our word for medicine, but it seems to be related to the word uwodu, which is beauty. And so, just like the Navajo, they have hojon. For us, Nowoti kind of carries that same value. People say things like bad medicine, but you don't say it in Cherokee. Basically, the idea is that medicine is for good. Adosteth dolti is what they say. Adosteth dolti is gonna. It's a danti. Dajefen the gostan. If this is what you use, things will be better. That's what will happen. Things will be better. So it's to make your life better. It's to make the world better. It's not to get one up on somebody else or to get even if somebody cuts you off in traffic. That's not what it's about. That was not even a part of it. It's not just the prayers that you pray and how you pray. It's not just the ceremonies that you go through. It's how you think about things and how you talk about people. It's a way to focus your mind and your attention to make your life better and the people around you happier and healthier. So I don't like to use the term bad medicine, but sometimes the best stories are when people are using it for the wrong purposes. So I'll tell you a story like that first, and then I'll go into happier stories. A long time ago, there were these two brothers. And one of the brothers was big and strong, very athletic. He was a good hunter. He was such a good hunter that when he went out to the woods, he was able to bring back enough game, not just for himself and his own family, but sometimes for several families in the community. Even when things were scarce, he was successful, miraculously successful. And the community appreciated him and looked up to him. Cherokees always look up to people that can do things with their hands. Athleticism is something that is respected and valued. His brother, though, was weak. He was born sickly. He was kind, but he was sensitive, and he was not a good hunter. But he was a good listener, and so people would come to him with their problems. And because he suffered so much in his own life, he had a lot of wisdom in that regard. He would listen to them, and he would make them feel better. So he had a place. But as he got older, he began to get a little bit jealous of his brother because he thought to himself, if I sit and visit with these people and I make them laugh and I make them feel better, why don't they like me as much as they like him? And he began to feel a little bit left out. And so he would start to complain about his brother to folks that would come and visit with him. And although he would make them feel better, they didn't really want to come and visit with him as much because he was always complaining about somebody that they liked and respected. Now, he wasn't just somebody that listened to problems. He was also somebody that knew a lot about the world around him. He observed the natural environment. He knew a lot about nature, plants and trees, roots and animals and flowers and birds. He was kind of a natural philosopher, and he was really best when he was alone in the woods. And he knew how to listen to things. And he learned some roots were good for some illnesses. Some flowers were good for other illnesses. Even certain body parts of animals were good for certain ways to help heal people. And so people didn't just come to him for advice, they came to him for medicine. But when he started talking bad about his brother, they thought his medicine had turned. And so they quit coming to him as much. Well, he got more and more angry. And this anger and bitterness began to be really focused on his brother. And he began to have public altercations. So his brother would bring home a deer, and he would walk up to his brother and say, I could do that. I could do that. I could be a good hunter. They would love me like they loved you. I could do that. Why don't you make me a bow? His brother said, you couldn't draw the string back if I made it for you. He said, I could do it. I could do anything you can do. So his brother made him a bow, and he wasn't able to use it. He would go out in the woods and he would practice. He would try to build up a strength, but it wasn't his fault. It wasn't like a deficit of character. He was ill. He wasn't able to do what he needed to do to hunt. And one day he was out in the woods practicing, and it was getting late in the evening in the springtime, and out of the west, some dark clouds started to roll in, and the wind had started to blow and gust, and the leaves were whipping around in the trees. And as it got darker and darker, he realized that the storm was on him so fast he wasn't going to get back in time to take shelter. So he just kind of hunkered down in the woods, and the wild animals would dash from here to there as that storm hit. And the thunder was crashing and lightning was striking all around him. And right next to him, right where some deer were panicked, and they were kind of stampeding past him, this big lightning bolt struck this oak tree right next to it. Struck it right next to him with this big, powerful boom. And it was so loud and percussive it knocked him to the ground. And he was on the ground, and his ears were ringing, and his eyes were watering, and his heart was beating fast. And he thought he heard in the voice of the thunder some words. The thunder, or the ringing in his ears, there were these words that kept repeating in his head again and again and again. And when he looked up at that tree that had been struck by lightning, there were splinters sticking out all the way down the east side. So with those words repeating in his head, he walked over to that tree and he took some of those splinters and he put them on his hand and absently just rolled them around in his hand. And he said those words while he was doing it. And he was blowing in his hand, and he was blowing on those lightning-struck splinters, and he was saying those words. And about that time, a deer ran past, and he touched that splinter, and he pointed at that deer, and that splinter shook like this and shot off right into that deer's heart. He said, I can hunt. He held his bow, and he held those splinters, and he put them in his pocket, and he proceeded to drag that deer home. He brought it into the village, and everybody was shocked. They said, wow, he was able to do it. But a lot of people said, I don't think so. There's something else going on here. They already distrusted him. And even though he would go out in the woods and he would bring back game, Nobody believed that he was the one that was shooting. And he got really mad one day and he said, I bring back just as much as my brother, but you guys care about him because he's strong and he's handsome, and you don't care about me. You don't care about me, but I'm the better hunter. I bring back more than he does. And you look down on me. And so he challenged his brother in front of everyone. He said, I want to prove to everybody here that I'm the best hunter. His brother says, fine, you're the best hunter. And he goes, no, we're going to prove this. Tomorrow, we're both going to go out in the morning. We're going to come back, and we're going to bring whatever we can back. And the one who brings back the most wins. And his brother's like, no, I don't think we need to do that. You're the best hunter, everybody. It's fine. He's like, no, this is what we're going to do. In front of everybody, this is what we're going to do. So the next morning came, and the two brothers went out in the woods to hunt. And it was a rough day. And that the brothers kept coming back into town empty-handed, just to see if the other brother brought something back. And every time they would come back, they'd say, did he bring something? Everybody's like, no. He's checked back, but he hasn't brought anything. And so it was getting towards the end of the day. And that skinny brother, the sickly one, was out there with his lightning struck splinters. He was walking around whispering, and he saw this deer. It was a huge buck standing there. And he saw it. He was just about to point at it, but across the way, he saw his brother, who already had his arrow knocked and pulled. And he knew that if he released it, he would get that deer first. So without thinking, he pointed it at his brother. And they say that was the first time it was used for bad purposes. I forget who told me that. Benny Smith, you guys. He told me that story. He told me a lot of cool stories. He also said that we started not here, not back east, but somewhere in the south. He said that we lived on this island surrounded by water that you couldn't drink. Hastings, you guys used to talk about this too. So we lived on this island surrounded by undrinkable water. And this island had mountains on it, forests, springs. It was beautiful and ideal. It had everything that we needed, but most importantly, it had these giant turtles. And these giant turtles were like, for us, these giant turtles were like how the bison were for our Plains brothers and sisters. So we were told that these turtles were for us, and we took care of these turtles, and they took care of us. That every year, those turtles would come ashore, and they would lay their eggs, and we would guard over the eggs. Sometimes we would even help the hatchlings back out into the water. And it was the rule. It was passed down from one generation to the next to respect these turtles, and they would take care of us. The shells were so big, we could build our shelters out of them. We could use them for canoes. We used every part of those turtles when we harvested. We showed them the utmost respect. I don't know if it was just the times changed. And it used to be when the little kids would try to climb on a turtle's back and ride it, the adults would get on to them and say, hey, melagi docs, and say, leave that turtle alone. And something happened. It was just a change, maybe a generational shift. But those kids talked back and they said, nothing bad ever happened, just leave us alone. The elders are like, you know what? And maybe they're right. And so the parents let the kids do what they shouldn't do. And at some point, it was just normal. It was just normal behavior. And nobody really remembered, except for this one old man who lived on the beach. And he would come outside and he'd get on to those kids. Say, "Kan the God dizio, it's the dasta one. Docs, nelagi, leave the turtle alone. Listen up, you kids, leave the turtle alone." And one afternoon, there were 4 little kids that were on the back of this turtle, and they were riding it as it was making its way across the beach out to the water. And that old man came out and said, "Come, he's off long hand, get off of it." And they said, "We don't have to do nothing. We don't have to listen to you. Nothing bad is going to happen. We've heard the stories. Everybody knows nothing bad is going to happen." And he got upset and he went back inside of his little shack. And after a while, he got to feeling bad. At first, he was thinking, "Well, I don't care. They're not my kids. It's not my responsibility. Not my monkeys, not my circus, whatever." And after a while, he got to feeling bad. This is my responsibility. This is how I was taught. And even if I'm the last one alive that knows this, it's my job to remind people. So he went back outside, and they were really close to the water, and the water was starting to lap up on the edge of that turtle shell. And he said, "Come, it's all flowing. Did the doc say stay? Get off that turtle, be careful." And those kids said, "What are you worried about? We got plenty of time. We've got plenty of time. We can ride this turtle out to the water and just, when it gets out to the deep part, we'll just swim right back. We'll be fine. Don't you worry about us, old man. Worry about your own business." They went back inside. After a while, his conscience pulled him back outside again. And at this point, they were already in the water. He said, "Did the doc say stay? You guys watch yourselves. Be careful." And they said, "We're fine. We're fine, leave us alone." Now, I don't know if it was a trick of the light, the way the sun was shining that day, or maybe the type of moss that was growing on that turtle's back. But when it came time for the little kids to get off the turtle, their legs were stuck to it. And that turtle had started to go down under the water, and those kids couldn't break free. And that water rose up past that turtle shell, past their legs, past their bellies and their chests, and finally went above their head, and they disappeared under the water. First time I heard this story, that was kind of how it ended. But I like another version I heard later. And the other version is the old man came back out the fourth time, beat a stick on the shore, and the water went down, and the turtle came up, and the kids broke free, and they swam to shore. Either way, they say that this was a portent of what was to come. This was an omen. And that the day came not too long after that. Shortly after that old man died, when the wisest of those elders, they got in these boats, these 7 white canoes, and they went to the north. But everybody else stayed on that island. And these elders that got on the canoes, they looked back at that island, and as it was going down, just like those kids on that turtle's back, that water rose up higher and higher and higher until everything was under the water. So it was still a sad ending. A lot of our stories are like that, I guess, you know. And they say that was our first world. That was our first world. And if you talk to those folks in North Carolina, a lot of them I talked to, especially when I started visiting them about 15 years ago, they would say, "This is where we came from. I was out at that Gadua Mound outside of Bryson City, and the mound is about 4 times as big as this room, but it's only about this high. And you don't know it's a mound until you get a ways out and kind of look at it. You can see that it's been farmed for 500 years, but it used to be a substantial mound, and they said that it had a huge council house on top, big enough for everybody in town to sit in and maybe even dance in. And that's where our fire lived. That's where the fire lived and breathed, and it lived deep down inside of that mound, and they would just kindle it there on top of the mound inside of that council house. And when they rekindled it, that fire on the top connected to the fire below. And it was one eternal living fire. And they say, I don't know if this is true, everybody likes to use science to back up oral tradition, but they say that they took thermal images of this mound. They say that it's still deep down inside of that mound, there's a hot spot. That fire's still alive. Which would be cool if it's true. I don't know how it breathes because there's no smoke coming out. except when it's foggy in North Carolina, which is every day. You can still tell the difference, right? Anyway, they said, this is where we came from. They would point at this mountain and they would say, this is where we came from. They said, there was no first world. This is the first world. This is our homeland. This is where we've always been. This is where we will always be. And when you guys get enough strength, you can come back here and join us. And we have an old prophecy that says one day we will return back to where we came from. But there's a second world, and there's a third world. We're living in the fourth world. And they say that we don't get a fifth. So maybe one day we'll go back to that island of giant turtles, maybe. I don't know. Or maybe we'll just go back to the third world, which is Cherokee. That's what we call it. Cherokee, the old Cherokee place. Now, the folks there, they call it Wadhe, which sounds more like beautiful land. And I like that. That's what they call it, Wadhe. They say that we chose those mountains because they were just like the mountains that we came from on the island. They had the springs and the clear water and the mountains and the trees. It reminded us of our original homeland. So in the past, even when we lived on that big island, we had this priesthood that was rough on us. And it was their job to live in a way where they were close with the spirit world, where everybody else could live their day. And these folks held themselves apart, and it was their job to be spiritually responsible for the community. And that's how it started. But sometimes they would, in their quest for power, they would become corrupt. And they would behave badly and become abusive. In the past, we would always leave these people behind and start over. We have cool stories where we had mountains made out of stone, and we used that priesthood, they used to sacrifice people's hearts to the fire. And we just left them behind. Well, this time, though, this was happening in our homeland, Cherokee, in those mountains, Wadhe. The priesthood had become so corrupt and vicious that they were mistreating people in all sorts of abusive ways. If you can imagine it, they were doing it. And the common people were left out of everything. And these folks were originally given this wisdom or this knowledge that gave them the ability to do miraculous things, things that by today's standards we would call science fiction or fantasy. They had these abilities that were miraculous, and they did not use them well. But our people were afraid, and there are stories about how they did this, and it's a cool story, and I don't have time for it. But what happened is, ultimately, our people decided to overthrow these priests. For the first time, instead of moving on, they overthrew them and they killed them. They said the streets ran red with blood, and this opened us up to worse things. Our people were not living right. There were 7 different groups, maybe 7 different villages in that area. Maybe 7 different clans, sometimes they say 7 different tribes. But 7 different groups were living there. And they quit following their teachings, they quit following their laws, they didn't keep their marriages, they didn't keep their ceremonies. Everything fell apart because their leaders were thrown away. And so this illness started to pass into the communities and creep among the homes and among the families, and people began to get sick. And all 7 of these groups, they noticed this illness was killing their people, and they didn't know what to do about it. They got together and they said, what would our priests have done? They said they would have fasted and they would have prayed. And they would have found a solution. They would have went to Nathana and they would have found a solution. So we can do that. We can fast and we can pray. So they chose the wisest, one from each one of those 7 different groups, to go out in the woods and fast and pray for 7 days and 7 nights. And the first one, from the largest community, he decided to climb the tallest mountain. And he started early the next morning, and it took him all day to get to the top of the mountain. And by evening, it was dark, and he reached the zenith of that mountain, and this thunderstorm rolled in from the west. And he heard in the voice of that thunder to build a fire. Some people say he built it in a circle, and he sat in the center. And he waited. On the next day, another one of those 7 that went out to fast and pray joined him. On the 3rd day, another one joined him. On the 4th day, another one joined him. This happened every day until on the 7th day, all 7 of them were up there around that fire, sitting, fasting, and praying. And it was in the middle of the night on that 7th night that one of the stars got bigger and bigger and bigger. It just got larger and larger until it became like a second sun in the sky. And it lit the sky up like daylight. And some people say a voice came from that light. Other people say that it came all the way to the surface. And it landed in the midst of that fire that they were sitting around. And out stepped a person wearing clothes with no seams, that glowed in the dark. Called him Pale. Usul again. And I asked Hasty Shades guy, so what that meant, and he said it means the feathered dragon. I was like, oh, like Mesoamerica? And he's like, yeah. Have you ever heard the word Usul again? How about you, Lawrence? Usul again? I think it just means pasty pale. Usul again, like the moon. Okay, Marilyn Cochran. Did you guys say he illegal? That's what she told me, because I was like awestruck. Oh, this is some. She goes, oh, that just means that he was pale. I was like, oh, I don't know. That's not what Hastings said. You know, you get different things, right? It sounds like a color. It has that gay on the end. This little gay. Anyway, whether it was a light in the sky talking to him or a guy stepping out of the fire, he said, "Iji gadu wage, iji keo san. Iji gadu wage, iji keo san." You forgot you are Katua. So you forgot you're human beings. You put away your laws, your teachings, you're living like animals, you're not doing things right. That's why that illness came among you. Your way of life has become corrupted. Your fires that you use for ceremony, they're all corrupt. Your medicine's corrupt. Your families are corrupt. He said, turn around. Behind each one of you is a plant. Some people say tree. I like tree. So if it's tree, we know what that medicine is. Anyway, he said, behind each one of you is a plant. And you take the 7 plants and you put them together on the new moon and you boil it and you make a wash and you wash off with it and you drink it and it will cure the illness of your people and it will keep you healthy through the generations to come. Just like your medicine has become corrupt, needs to be renewed, your families have become corrupt and need to be renewed. You need to leave here, turn around and walk until you see the sun. Come back and tell me the first thing that you see. So they turned around and walked off into the darkness. The next morning, they came back about mid-morning. The first one came back from the south and said, I guess, son, Wahai, or Wahyan, Uwasan, Wigadol, Jitigowa. I saw a wolf standing there alone. That's what I saw. The next one came back from the southeast. Some people said, Yon, Ugawarte. Maybe it was Yon, maybe it was something else. But he saw, we'll say, a bear standing there. And the one that came back from the east said, when I went down the hill a little ways, I was stopped by a spring. And there was water coming out of the mountain, and it was turning into a little creek. And I decided to wash myself and clean myself as the sun was coming up. And when I looked out across the way towards the east, there was a tree there, and it had moss flowing in the wind that looked like human hair. The next one came back from the northeast. So when I went to the water also, probably that same river, what I thought was just mud on the other side of the creek, when the sun came up, I looked up and it was bright red, like our war paint. The next one came back from the north and saw Galan Di, Galan Lohi, Uwoha, Ganohi Lidon, Chichigoba. Up high in the sky, I saw an eagle fly. The next one that came back from the northwest and saw, Galagain, we get dog, what do they call? a buck was standing there. The next one came back and said, when I went down by the water to wash off and clean myself, he said, when I looked up facing the east, that water was reflecting the light of the sun. It kind of blinded my eyes for a second. When I looked down, and all I saw was this vine with heart-shaped leaves growing along the side of the water, wild potato plant. And that person said to them, from now on, you can't marry somebody from your community. You're all intermarried. You have to marry somebody from one of these other 7 groups. Just like your medicine have become corrupt, your families have become corrupt. You didn't keep your marriages. You don't know whose kids are whose anymore. All in your village, that's all one family now. You have to marry outside of that. So take family, people from each family and spread out. So 7 different families are in each one of those communities. And don't marry in your same family. He said, take a piece of this fire, put it in that first community, take half of it, put it in the second community and take half, put it in the third and take half, and you will all share the same fire. You'll have one fire among you. Because your fires have become corrupt. He said, your teachings have become corrupt. And so he stayed with them and he taught them things like, Deita da geyu, says the. And Deita da plia, says the. Uoske, Deita da yela, says the. Deita da steliski, says the. Deita da nan velavo, says the. All these teachings that they talk about both at church and at the ceremonial grounds. All these teachings, he renewed these value systems for them. And he stayed with them for a while. And they say that from that day forward, we were renewed. We didn't have a priesthood like we did before. People were raised up from childhood to be leaders, but they were chosen because of their character. We had shared one fire, and you had to have all 7 families there to maintain that fire. And we used this medicine and we went to water every month on the new moon. So it was like a new way of life for us. And that was probably why people in North Carolina say that right there was where we became Cherokee. Because that first place they set that fire down when they came from that mountain was on that Gadua Mountain. That was the very first place, our mother town. So that's enough for stories. Do you guys have any questions? Thoughts, feelings?
I don't know.
Yes, sir.
I was just going to ask, is there any plans to create the schools in like where the Eastern Band is or any other remote areas?
Yeah, the Eastern Band do have an immersion school. It's called New Gadua Academy, and we work really closely with it.
Okay.
We've had some of the same struggles they have. Our primary problem is we have taken English curriculum and translated it into Cherokee. And that means that our kids can talk about photosynthesis and cell division in Cherokee, but they can't have conversations with others.
A couple real quick questions.
Yes, sir.
Children from the immersion school, are they in your program, any of them?
Some of them have, yeah.
And then the second question was, where do you see the language going? Of course, we think of Shakespeare in English and English now. Do you have any kind of vision, or do the linguists have a vision of when you lose these first language speakers, are you going to lose a lot?
Yeah, we're going to lose a lot. For the first time in my life, I have hope that we may be able to create some second language speakers that are near that level or comparable, but not at the rate that we're losing them. So it's not sustainable. So even if we're making 10 high-level second language speakers a year, if we're losing 10 a month, which is what we're losing now.
Is there that capacity when people learn the language to be able to create new words,
Yes.
concepts?
Yes.
So it will go to a different place.
It's possible as long as we can at least maintain momentum or build momentum. we will have the resources and the individuals that have the skill level to maintain a stream of the language. However, the vast majority of population doesn't have the incentive to learn it. And the effort that it takes to acquire it is a considerable challenge. So we need incentives that are equal to the value of the language. And we don't have the political will to do that.
I did have one more question. Is there a push to try to document all the old stories so that you don't lose them?
Yeah, we're following old folks around with recorders. And one day we'll go back and analyze it. But right now we're not. We're just trying to capture it. And the best way to capture it is by sitting down with the speaker and having a conversation. That is the absolute best way to capture it. That is also the hardest and the most labor intensive. So all the other recordings that we do are secondary. And we didn't start doing those until we could have a method of natural transmission created first. So our first goal was to have a method of natural transmission. And then we can do all the recordings we want, and we can feel like maybe we have a chance. But one of the cool things about Cherokee is because it's polysynthetic, each part of the word has a meaning that's not just unique to that word, but shared with other words. So Lawrence can say a word that I've never heard before, and even if I don't know the heart of that word, the root of that word, I'll know all the stuff around it. And if we're having a conversation, I will automatically understand that word that I've never heard before. And I can say words that have never been said before, and he can understand me. He'll say, nobody uses that word, but I know what you're saying. And that's what's amazing about the language. And I am nowhere near as fluent as I need to be. I've really grown in my fluency in the last 4 years, but since I've become an administrator, I don't feel good about going and sitting in the language sessions with the learners. It doesn't seem right to me to distract them. Basically classroom hopping. I mean, I'll poke my head in and wave at them, but to sit in there and disrupt class and put myself in the position of a learner doesn't seem appropriate to me. So I don't feel like I've lost much language, but I am rusty. And when I'm sitting in a situation where speakers are speaking, I'm okay. But if they just walk up to me, sometimes I'm like, oh, because it takes a minute for it to click in. So I'm at the point where I'm not losing language anymore, but I'm rusty. I'm definitely rusty. And although I worked for almost 20 years learning on my own, it's really been since the Master Apprentice Language programs come into fruition. Because at first, I had to sit in there. We had to work with the speakers to get the learning methodology, the teaching methodology down. And for the first 2 years, I was a facilitator in that process. And then we could kind of push that process onto other learners that were also advanced. And now we have people that's their full-time job to sit in there and to help act as a go-between between the first language speakers and the learners, because the first language speakers are like drinking from a fire hydrant. So you got somebody like me sitting next to you that's saying, oh, ahidage hinan used utoy kaneja sti noodle. He ahidage is hanef the hina kaneja. There's an easier way to say it. This is easier. There's another way to say this. Try it this way. That sort of workaround, because speakers aren't necessarily used to speaking to people that don't understand them. So they're not always comfortable with saying it 15 different ways until they hit on the right one. But I've been there. And so I think in English, so I naturally make some of the same assumptions that other learners make, so I can kind of help them circumnavigate that process of learning. And now we have second language speakers in there that do that every day, all day long. They act as step downs. They're not the primary teachers, they're just there as like teacher's assistants. They also take attendance and do paperwork. Because we don't want our first language speakers to be distracted with that. If they want to do paperwork, but never have they said, you know what, I'm gonna do the timesheets. Let me take that over for you. It doesn't happen. So I think there's a good future. I think that it is possible. If we can get immersion schools in 5 or 6 communities, and we can get adult immersion programs in 3 or 4 communities, then I think that we'll always have a minority of Cherokees that are strong in the language. We may never get back to how it was when Lawrence was young, but as long as we have a group of people that are keeping it alive, it could happen.